Good evening and welcome to Law Talk. Tonight, with Mark Malachowski and James Barrett, we're going to bring the law to your living room so that you can be on the same page with those trying to interpret it for your benefit. Good evening, Mark. How are you doing?
Doing fine, Jim. How are you?
Well, I understand that we're going to revisit one of the subjects we've done before.
On June 5th, we talked a little bit about the Death on the High Seas Act. And that was an act that was passed about 80 years ago that limits the liability of the employer of seamen who die on the high seas. And in the case of the Gulf oil spill, that would limit what the families could recover for the death of a loved one who was working on that rig during the explosion to $1,000 for each person.
Well, at $1,000, that's just not enough to compensate those families. And those families are looking to BP to really take it and provide for them the monies and the life and the future that their family members would have provided but for their death.
Well, there's a couple of things that come up when we're talking about liability caps. After the Exxon Valdez spill, there was a liability cap of $75 million put on an oil spill.
Yeah, but that was 20 plus years ago, so $75 million then is a lot different than the inflationary $75 million of today. So what's BP really trying to do today?
Well, it looks like they've agreed to put in a trust account or escrow account $20 billion.
Yeah, but that $20 billion, I did hear about that, Mark, but that $20 billion is never going to be able to compensate all the fishermen, all the tourist attractions, all the hotel builders, the resorts, everything that's on the Gulf that's suffered. So what do you foresee that BP is going to be able to really do with $20 billion?
Well, it's hard to say what they're going to do with $20 billion. I think it's a substantial sum, and from a legal standpoint, it may have waived their privilege on the Death on the High Seas Act and on the $75 million limit.
And we're talking about is if we put that $20 billion into a trust account, they're automatically going above and beyond both the Death on the High Seas Act and the $75 million max that was existing at the time of the Horizon disaster. Is that correct, Mark?
That's correct, and it would be hard for Congress to go back and change the law after events already happened.
Well, I understand in the Constitution you can't create laws that go back and interfere with a prior event and then have somebody liable for that event. Isn't that under ex post facto? Or?
Ex post facto, yeah, that's correct. But if you waive your privilege, then that might be often running through the amounts we're talking about. So we're talking about at least $20 billion at this point.
Well, you know, this goes to take us back to the permitting process for the Deep Horizon well. I understand that the MMS, which is the
Mineral Management Services,
correct, was responsible for ensuring the BP did the well drilling and the creation of the deep, because it's a mile deep. They were tasked to have double walls on their pipes. They were tasked with pressure tests on a regular basis, I think every 6 hours. And they were also tasked with ensuring that in the event of a spill, there'd be pressure blowouts that would stop the oil from spilling.
Well, on this particular incident, even though the forensics aren't complete, there was apparently 4 permit changes in one day about a month before the spill occurred, where some of the factors that might have led to the disaster seem to have been streamlined. They used a single pipe instead of a double pipe. There might have been some problems with the pressure testing. It's really hard to tell at this point from the forensics. But what's interesting about it is that the person in charge of the Mineral Management Service at that time was a linguist major. They weren't a professional engineer. And it seems like they might have had from the top down, maybe not the technical expertise or the technical aspect or viewpoint that might have prevented such a problem.
Yeah, but somebody that's in charge of the MMS is responsible for something that dramatic, especially deep-sea drilling. Their responsibility lies in being able to understand what deep-sea drilling. They should be somebody that's been involved with deep-sea drilling on their own in private practice of some sort. And I understand that the person they actually put in charge of the MMS was a linguist. And what is actually the main purpose of a linguist?
Well, we talked about this a little bit last time, but they do things like look at poems and look at written word, for example, looking at haikus and that kind of thing for their dissertation. But they're definitely not petroleum engineers. Now, there's other folks who are, smooth-talking political pundits from overseas who claim that, if you just had more people working at the Mineral Management Service, I think it was about 3,000. If you had 3 times as many people working there, then you never would have had a disaster. But it seems to me that I think, if you remember Emperor Claudius?
Yes, I do. The Claudius. We've all grown up watching that and understanding that.
Okay, and remember he had there was something particular about Emperor Claudius, the
Yes,
Roman Empire.
he had a speech impediment.
Okay, and they didn't want to make him emperor, even though he was in the bloodline, because he stuttered. And what was his response when they said, well, you can't be emperor because you're not a smooth talker?
Well, as I remember correctly, his response was, it's not the quantity of words you say, but the quality of those words. And I can see if you think you can hire a large volume of people to work in a government agency, doesn't mean that government agency is going to work more smoothly. Is that correct, Mark?
Well, also, when I did some engineering in my past career and, worked with government agencies, there was always kind of a saying for engineers, if you have 10 years of experience in private enterprise, you get 10 years of experience. You work for the government for 10 years, you get 1 year experience 10 times. So I think there's a big difference in a government job and a private enterprise job. And I think if you have a viewpoint that only people who've only studied government, only worked in government, are interfacing with corporations and doing this kind of technical work, the government employees may not have the hands-on, day-to-day technical expertise. They really need to look at a permit and say, what are the risk factors here? They don't have the hands-on experience of working on an oil rig. They've worked in an office or something like that in Washington, D.C., but they've never worked on an oil rig. And I really think you need to have someone who's been out there, had hands-on technical experience, has the professional engineer rating, that license, has a petroleum engineering degree or an oceanography degree, something like that, should be leading this agency, Mineral Management Service, so they really can look at a permit application and look at the technical aspects and see, is this a good application or not?
Well, I understand, though, that let's go back to the linguist factor. I understand that there was a haiku that you created for tonight's show that would represent the disaster in the Gulf. Can you talk about that?
Well, since my first degree was a Bachelor's of Science in Oceanography, and now we have people that are writing haikus doing the oceanography, instead of hiring an oceanographer or an engineer, I figured, oceanographer would give a shot at haiku, so I came up with hiring pitiful, losers in vast quantities, certain disaster.
Well, that leads to actually something, because a haiku is I like to step up to something on the BP, and that's the First Amendment question. So when we look at that haiku, you've actually stated something that can reach beyond a haiku, and that goes to the First Amendment that is being trampled during this BP disaster. And I understand that there's a vast amount of censorship that's going on, where we're not even seeing the animals that are soaked in oil. We're not allowed, reporters are not allowed to go to the beaches, all the beaches, and look at how much oil is being spilled. And I understand we sent out a correspondent to try and find out some information, Mark. What did we find out?
Well, our intrepid reporter went down to the Gulf to try to get some information on how the spill cleanup's going and what's going on there. But we wanted to have a live TV roll-in feed with our reporter, but since all the information's been cut off because of the embargo, but we did manage to sneak a carrier pigeon up from the Gulf, and so here we go. And so we do have a note.
I understand. He looks like he didn't make it back.
No, he's doing fine. He just needs a little scrubbing. He'll be fine. But on the one thing the Mineral Management Service was thinking of doing, they were going to put a wetting band on the leaky pipe down there at the bottom of the ocean.
And why were they going to put a wetting band on the leaking pipe?
Well, I think the theory was that then it might stop putting out.
Well, Mark, that's a long story, but I understand there is a happy ending to all of this. I understand that BP is at a success point. Just today, I've been reviewing the news, and it appears that they have put another cap on top, and we're hoping that cap that stops out oil might actually stop the moratorium that the government's been trying to put on the drilling of deep-sea oil wells. What do you know about that moratorium, Mark?
Before we get to that, Jim, let's talk about some of the some of the mitigation activities that have been going on down there. Now, this is about 70 days into the spill. The Jones Act was still not suspended, and that could have meant that foreign vessels could have come in and helped with cleanup. And there's just been a lot of bureaucratic delays, and so that has been a problem. Also, the EPA put a 15 part per million oil limit on what can be discharged, and 15 part per million is pretty low. And so if you have a skimmer, you might be discharging something way above 15 parts per million, but much better than basically if the oil, like you saw on our carrier pigeon, is a million parts per billion. Right. So that has been a problem. So they haven't got the skimmers going as quick as they wanted, and I'm talking about in the 70-day period. And also they wanted to put up sand berms.
Yeah, right? that was Governor Jindal.
Yeah.
And what had happened was he requested the EPA waive. Actually, the Army Corps of Engineers waived some EPA rules so that he could build sand berms so that the oil wouldn't reach the shores of his state. And I also understand that those were not waived, and as a result of that, he had the complete swath of the oil come into the marshes, the rivers, and the beaches.
Well, what happened there was kind of like they finally did get some okays on some of. They tried it, and it actually was reasonably effective. So, but it was kind of like closing the barn door after the horses already left. So there was several situations here where there was bureaucratic red tape that slowed down the spill for a matter of 60, 70 days. And then getting back to the moratorium, that's a very controversial issue as well, because if you're shutting down a well, there's also a risk in shutting down a well.
Yes, and well, the moratorium is pretty dramatic, because what they're proposing is they stop all drilling of deep sea sites, and now they're trying to expand that to all deep sea drilling and coming into towards the shore. So what's also happening is, because of this, the same states that are already suffering their loss of employment are going to actually suffer a greater loss of employment because of the loss of the man hours, the shipping, the vendors, and all the activities that go to service those wells.
Yeah, well, also when you look at the scientific basis for the moratorium, there was a little bit of confusion there, because there was a paper that went out and it said these scientists all agreed that there should be a moratorium. And then once that was made public, the scientists came out and said, well, that's not the same paper that they had signed. It seems like there was actually pages added to a document after they'd put their signatures on that. Now, if you did that in civil law, what would that be considered?
Well, that would be contempt of court, and it actually could be an offense, a criminal offense. But I did hear about that, and those scientists all did come out, and what they had signed did not have any language that said there needed to be a moratorium. In fact, the document that was submitted to court by the administration indicated that scientists had in fact asked for the moratorium.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of confusion. I mean, I've never heard of anything like that. Usually, when you sign a document, people don't staple pages, between page 1 and the signature,
That's correct.
And if they are going to do an addendum or exhibit, I think they'd have to re-sign.
Yeah, and I also understand now that even though Judge Feldman, the federal bench, had denied the moratorium request, that the Interior Secretary is actually asking for a second moratorium, and he's going to try and push that through with different language, so it fulfills the wishes of the idea of stopping all drilling.
Well, Judge Feldman thought that it was the moratorium was too blanket, too generic. He said it was a punitive moratorium, and he's saying the blanket moratorium with no parameters seems to assume that because one rig failed, and although no one yet fully knows why, all companies and rigs drilling new wells over 500 feet also universally present an imminent danger. So, I mean, when you're going into some kind of